So the real question is, do I still want to read these books? Because I did buy them a while ago, most of them. I did say a long time ago that I really wanted to read them. So we're going to go through the list. I've picked one out for every letter of the alphabet because I'm incorporating them into my bingo board this year, into my TBR game this year, and I'm just going to give you a sneak peek of what you may see come up if I choose a TBR vet. And for each of these books, I don't know that I'm going to go into detail about what these books are about, so much as share as why I think I still have not read these books yet. Because that's what it's coming down to for a lot of these is I said a while ago, years ago, that I wanted to read these books and I still haven't. So why is that? Let's explore, because I don't know the answer to that yet. The first book on this list is Breast and Eggs. This is by Mieko Kawakami. And yeah, this book, I believe, is supposed to have sort of like a feminist lean to it. It's supposed to explore women's issues, that kind of thing. Sounds very fascinating to me. Why have I not picked this up yet? I really couldn't tell you. Other than I think in my mind, I am telling myself that it's a very literary book. Literary fiction doesn't always work for me. And so I'm not sure how this book is going to work for me. So let's go with that. I think it might be too literary. So let's make categories as we go along and see just how many books fit into each of these categories. So our first category is going to be it might be too literary. The next book is Calculating Stars. Oh, and I'm saying that I'm going in order, but I'm not. This is C. We'll go with this. A is over here for some reason. Anyway, for C, I have The Calculating Stars. Why haven't I read this? I think just because it's a series and I don't know, well, I know I'm not a series person. And so I think I'm putting it off because I feel like if I read this, I'd have to read the rest of the series. Like going back to letter A. So for A, I have American Gods by Neil Gaiman. And this is actually on my TBR for January. We'll see if I actually read it this month because it's on the pile of possibilities. But if I skip it again, why might it be? Partially because I keep getting this confused with Good Omens. Thank you, Jamie, for correcting me on that, because I described this in my TBR video for January incorrectly. So I think part of the reason I don't want to read this is because I've actually forgotten what this book is about, and therefore it's just not calling to me. So let's go with the, I don't remember what it's about. D is for Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver, and I have a couple of theories as to why I haven't read this book. One, if you notice, I now have the paperback edition, and you can also see my hardback edition right there at the tip of my finger. And I had been waiting for a very long time for this to come out in paperback. So there are a couple reasons I think I haven't read this yet. One, I think maybe the book was overhyped. Two, I tried it and it wasn't grabbing me right away. Three, I really did want to read it in the paperback edition. The Ember Blade. This is another fantasy that is on my TBR still, and I still want to read it. At the time, I was reading a lot of fantasy because that's what got me reading again in my later adult life, if you will. And since then, I've really gone back to my true love, which is classics. And that doesn't mean I don't read fantasy. I do, it's just I don't reach for it as often. I have The Fingersmith. This is a reread for me, and I think that's why it's not one of the first books that I'm picking up. I do want to reread it eventually, but I'm not a big rereader. So another book that is a fantasy that I'm just putting off, probably just because it's a fantasy, is Grace of Kings. It is also a really chunky fantasy, so that may have something to do with it as well, is that nowadays I'm just less likely to take the time and put a lot of effort into a long fantasy novel. I have Hopscotch. This is a work of literary fiction. The structure of this book is supposed to be unusual, and apparently there's actually 2 different reading orders in which you can work your way through this book, which sounds really fascinating to me. But I feel like I've also seen things that have said that this book is kind of difficult to read and understand. So I'm going to say that I'm not picking it up because I'm intimidated by it. Another book that I have that is just not being picked up because it's a reread is I Know This Much Is True by Wally. I read this ages ago. It must have been in high school. I don't know how appropriate that is based on what I have recently heard about this book, but I do want to reread it, and probably more so than my other reread. It's also kind of a chunky book, So it's not really coming up that quickly for me, but hopefully soon, because of the ones that I've mentioned so far, this is probably the one where when I remember that it's on my shelf, I'm like, ooh, I do want to get back to that. For the letter J, there is Jerusalem. This is just flat out a humongous fantasy novel. So fantasy seems to be if it's fantasy and super long, I'm not picking it up to read. So I'm pretty sure that's why this is there. It's also intimidating. Back to the not picking it up because it's fantasy, Kings of the Wild. This book was really hyped, which doesn't bother me, and it's supposed to be really funny, which I like the idea of, but it is also a series, which is a negative because I know the chances of my moving on in the series is super unlikely, and frequently the books aren't resolved well because they're a series, and so I'm just slow to start series because I know I don't want to finish them. I am interested in The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. This is another book that I'm actually pretty excited to get to, but for some reason just keep passing up. My guess is, again, because it's a series and I just don't want to start a series. Though this is a series that I feel like I would finish. It's just the idea of going through a series. It just doesn't do it for me. The Mask of Mirrors definitely falls into the it's chunky, it's a fantasy, it's a series. Oh, this may be like my number one reasons that I'm not picking up books. Which now that I think about it, as I create this list of reasons I'm not reading these books, maybe this will help tell me what books I should avoid buying. That sounds reasonable. I also have The Native Son. This is a book I actually really do want to read, and I just haven't picked it up. I think this is one that just hasn't come up in my TBR game, and so I am hoping to get to this. I did put it on my list of most anticipated reads for this year, specifically because I do actually really want to read this book. I just somehow haven't gotten to it. I have The Overground Railroad. This is a book that I've also really been wanting to read for a long time. In fact, if I order it on Storygraph, this is the book that I've been wanting to read the longest of all the books that I own. The only reason I think I have not read this book yet is because I've been told that because there are pictures in it that you want to own a copy of it, and I only just finally bought it this year. I think I didn't buy it sooner and therefore read it sooner because I don't tend to go to the nonfiction section in bookstores, and so I wasn't being reminded when I would go into a bookstore that I wanted to read it. And the couple of times I would go into a bookstore and intentionally want to buy a couple of specific books, that just didn't happen to be the book I wanted to pick up at the time. I am making a grand old mess over here. Moving on to P, I have Project Hail Mary. This has just been sitting on my bookshelves for a while, I think because it's science fiction, which is just a genre that I enjoy but don't read from a lot. And I had heard good things about this book, but it was a type of science fiction, which I feel like is comedic science fiction, that I hadn't read from before I read The Martian last year. And so I just wasn't sure how I was going to feel about it. I did read The Martian last year, absolutely loved that book, so this is now more of a priority for me. So I expect this book to be read this year. Queen Margot is a book that I know is part of a series and can never remember whether it's the first book in the series or not, so I keep avoiding it. I have resolved that. It is the first book in the series, so now I know that if it comes up in my TBR game, this is a book I could pick. It is by Alexandre Dumas, who's an author whose works I want to read to zero, and like I said, I think I've just been avoiding this one because I could never remember where it was in the series, so it's a series. It's a serious problem is what it is. The Sword of Kaigen. This is a book that I've been wanting to read so long that it was a standalone when I purchased it and is now part of a series. But I think it's only part of a duology, so that helps. So why haven't I picked it up? Fantasy, chunky series. The Romance of the Three Kingdoms is a epic of warlord schemes and heroes, and it is a type of I almost want to say it's a type of fantasy, but not really. But it's a Chinese classic. I have been very fascinated by everything I have heard about this book, but I still haven't picked it up. It comes in 3 volumes, I think, or maybe there's 3 books in the series. I think it's 1 book in 3 volumes, if I recall correctly. It really doesn't clarify on my edition. And I think that's the only reason I haven't picked it up, is that it's either a series or multiple volumes. So it's just a big, chunky book. And honestly, for some reason, I think because it's a different type of literature than I typically read, haven't read a lot of Chinese literature, I think I'm also intimidated by it. I have Tigana by Guy Gavriel Kay, and this is a classic of science fiction or fantasy, maybe fantasy, but I feel like it has some like science fiction vibes, but that might just be because of the cover. Anyway, this falls into the chunky fantasy, at least in my mind, even if that's incorrect. And so I think that's why I've been putting it off. I also don't hear this book talked about a lot, and then the couple of times I have, I feel like I've been hearing like mixed reviews, but it's mainly just because it's a chunky fantasy. For you, I have Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is a classic, which means it should be up my alley, but for some reason, it's a book that is just not standing out to me. So I don't know. I think of all the books that I have that start with the letter U, it's also one that I just feel like is going to be slower paced. And, you know, more than anything, I think it's a book that I feel like I should read, but not one that I really want to. Like, at least not one that I'm excited to read. So I think that's what's going on there. Vanity Fair is a book that I just haven't gotten around to yet. And it is one that I really want to read. It is something that I'm trying to prioritize. It's longer, so sometimes with my TBR game, it just hasn't made the cut, but it's not because it intimidates me. I just really haven't gotten to this book, and I really want to. Okay, getting down towards the end, I have The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle by Haruki Murakami. So what's going on with this book? One, I have a lot of books whose title starts with the letter W on my shelf. And the reason I'm not picking this one is because I've read other work by Haruki Murakami, like 1Q84 and what is it? After Midnight, After Magic, After something. I'll put it on the screen. And I had issues with both those books, so I'm really just not sure how I feel about him as an author and whether or not I do actually like his writing. I've had a lot of people say that they think this is his best book or his only book that they enjoy. He did recently come out with a new book, and I've heard nothing about that yet. But I think that's why I'm not picking it up, is that there's just a lot of other things in that section of my library that I'd prefer to read. Okay, and the last three books, I have XX. This is a book that I do want to read. I actually finally bought it last year, I believe it was. I had just been putting off buying it, just didn't get to it. I did finally get to this book last year, but I got to it towards the end of the month, so it was a carryover, and I just never picked it back up because it was actually kind of, I don't know. It was just kind of an in-between book for me and in terms of how I was feeling about it, so I never felt pressed to pick it back up. It is also on my list of books that I haven't finished in 2024 that I want to finish this year. So I don't even know that this book should really be on this list. It is one of the oldest books I own whose title starts with the letter X, but it's also the only book that I own whose title starts with the letter X. For the letter Y, I have You Shall Not Kill. This book definitely falls under the it's chunky. So maybe those sections do need to stay separate. It's just no, it's that it's intimidating. I like chunky books. That's not what's throwing me off. Something about this book I find intimidating. I think I'm also worried that it's going to be too slow, like pace-wise. So I think that's what's intimidating me about it, is that it's going to be a super long, chunky, slow-paced book. I have no reason for thinking that. This is just complete bias, probably based on the picture on the cover. And then the final book is Zanoni by Edward Bulwer Lytton, and I have it in this nice edition here. And what is it about this book? It's a bizarre topic. Is that a new category? It's a bizarre topic? Maybe this is, I don't know that much about it. I don't know. Whatever it is, I'm just not picking it up. In fact, I think I've had times where I could get it onto my game and onto my TBR, and I've said, nah, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to take a unicorn pick. So, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, I have a TBR game and all that fits into there. That's the huge chunk of all the books that I've just been avoiding. So there are 26 of them, one for every letter of the alphabet. I'm sure there's probably more than 26, but those are the ones that are on the list for now. As I read these, I will update my TBR vets list to include whatever the second oldest book is that starts with the same letter. And yeah, maybe halfway through the year, I'll do an update video and talk about which ones of these I've read and which ones are now replacing them and who knows what. But let me know, do you have books on your shelf that are just sort of, aging like a fine wine and you're hoping are getting better day by day? Leave a comment below and let me know. Thank you for watching this video. Happy New Year, by the way, because I don't think I've said that in any of my videos yet. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm pre-recording. That's what's happening. It's still December for me right now, so I don't know what time it is. I don't know when I'm posting this. But I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will talk to you next time. Bye!